the idyllic villages that cling to our coastline. Known for their beauty and serenity.
Wow, look at this, just incredible.
Now destinations for our leisure.
This is like exploring a jungle.
But once they played a vital role in our history.
That's got to be the Lost Village. I'm Ben Robinson, and as an archaeologist, I'm fascinated by coastal villages. I want to explore them, discover their histories, and unearth their surprising pasts.
I've come to the village of Culross in Fife. The village sits on the hilly north bank of the Firth of Forth, 18 miles to the west of Edinburgh.
In the 17th century, this village had a world first. It's amazing to come out here to see this.
Fortunes were made and spectacular houses built.
Look at this.
This was a room that was really a way of showing off to visitors.
And I'll discover the surprising dark past of Culross.
You are actually standing in a room that was used for women that were accused of being witches.
There's a fascinating story to this village by the sea. Culross today is charming, it's unique, it seems frozen in time. But 400 years ago, in the 17th century, this was a bustling trading port, and it led the way in an industry that was to power the world for centuries to come.
I'm here to find out how this trade created great wealth and shaped the village we see today. Culross is renowned as one of Scotland's most picturesque villages. Built on a steep hill, its cobbled streets run down to the shoreline.
Walking through Culross is like walking back in time. In fact, this is said to be one of the most complete and perfect 17th century royal boroughs anywhere in Scotland. And royal borough, that's the key to this place. This is the Crown granting special privileges to the people here. The right to elect magistrates, representation in the Scots Parliament, but also special trading rights. And it's clues to that trading past that I'm looking for. I've just arrived in this little open area, and this looks like a lovely little market space. And like any good market, it's got its market cross. You see there, Market Cross. Imagine this, now quiet little space being the centre of all this activity. People, animals, all flooding in here to trade. Proclamations being read out on the base of the cross. All the population of the village coming in to listen. Here we go. This is Hag's Wynd. Wynd just means a narrow street or a lane. It used to be called Stinking Wynd, a very evocative name because back in the day, there was no rubbish disposal to speak of. People would just chuck all their household waste, everything, out into the street, and it would perhaps flow down here. But I can see there's gutters. See these granite sets running down the side of the street here. This is to channel away all the nasty fluids down the slope here. And there's a local thought that if you're a member of the gentry, you'd walk high and dry in the centre of the street on these big slabs here. And if you were someone of a lower status in society and were showing deference as they went by, you'd literally be backing towards the gutter. You'd be in the gutter.
The size and scale of the houses here show the prosperity of this once bustling trading town. And I've found a great example of this.
This house is one of the earliest in the village. Classic 17th century Culross architecture. Absolutely wonderful. Crow-stepped gable there. These dormer windows with the decorated triangular gablet on top there. And there's a date on one of them, very handy, 1636.
Current owner Stuart Powell has lived here for 2 years.
So this is the fireplace. It's quite the centerpiece.
Oh, and look at this. Massive block of stone, all one piece.
I dread to think how they actually got it in the original builders. It's just huge.
And for the size of the room, it's such a big fireplace. You can't help feeling that the room was a bit larger originally.
Absolutely. I mean, I think maybe twice the size of what it is now, and over the years, clearly there's been some kind of building and changes to the kind of the structure of the house. But there's another feature upstairs which I think you might quite like, and it's quite interesting, so shall I take you up there?
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. So this is where 2 of the bedrooms are, and really the best piece of the house, in my opinion. Well, welcome to the bedroom.
Oh, wow. I did not expect to see anything quite like this.
And I believe this is the original plasterwork when the building was built in 1636.
It's just extraordinary to me to think about, you know, what this room could have been used for. Was it a bedchamber? A very posh one? Someone important? Because it clearly started off as a grand house.
Yeah.
The big fireplace, this room, those dormers, everything looks like a big merchant's house.
Yep. Certainly someone who probably had a lot of money at the time. It's amazing to be living here.
In the 1600s, enterprising merchants would have made money from trading goods out of the village's busy harbour. But where was that harbour?
This is an intriguing structure. It's obviously been deliberately preserved and displayed here. This is a platform, and it's paved, and it's heading off in that direction. I think the massive anchor might be a clue. Well, this is unexpected. It's a railway line, and it extends as far as the eye can see in both directions. It really cuts off the village from the sea. Now this is starting to make sense. The structure that I saw in the park over there, that's part of this structure. It's a pier. Now it seems to be in 2 parts, and they're joined by a wooden footbridge, but they all form part of a harbour structure. Now the thing is, if there's some of that harbour structure in the park, that means the harbour used to extend much further inland than it does today. It means that that park is on reclaimed land. I've got some images here that help prove that point. This is a lovely map from the middle of the 18th century, and what it shows is a shoreline going right in there, right up to the houses of the village. That's completely different to how it appears today. Then if I move to another image here, this is a wonderful drawing of the village in 1693. And again, you can see on this just how close the waterfront came to the village. In fact, the origins of this harbour, this port, go way back into history, way before the Norman conquest. It's a very, very early port. This was one of Scotland's busiest on the mainland, and this was fuelled by the industry in the area. One of the prime industries was the coal industry.
This area of Fife has a rich seam of coal. Monks mined here from the 1300s, but their early coal pits were plagued by flooding. In the 1500s, a young entrepreneur, George Bruce, took ownership of the mine. He had an idea to solve the problem and make his fortune. Mechanical engineer Dr. Shinny Samara has looked into the feats of industrial engineering Bruce achieved here.
The monks here had been mining for coal and using coal for fuel, but Bruce wanted to do things on a much bigger scale. He's got bigger ambitions.
Yeah, this is a massive mining engineering conundrum. The coal seams were extending out to underneath water, but Bruce was very entrepreneurial. He knew how to make money, develop technology, and I think that's what was driving his ambition, the fact that this challenge could be taken on. And this was the world's first coal mine to reach out under the water.
To mine coal from under the water, Bruce connected his inland mine shafts to a man-made island in the estuary called the Moat Pit. But there was still an issue with drainage.
Water is a problem in mines on land. Water just seems to seep into them. It's always a problem trying to drain the mines. A mine surrounded by water, that's a massive problem. What did he do?
He resorted to the Egyptian wheel, which was a wonderful combination of rotating wheels, chains, and 36 buckets, all carrying water, which would have really put a strain on the horses, who were walking round and round in circles, turning a wheel, and that was bringing buckets of water out of the mine.
So he wasn't inventing this, it was something he'd seen working elsewhere that he could apply to this situation.
Exactly.
Just walking along the shoreline here, I've seen no other structures like this one that we can see here, these curving walls here. So is this the site of this Egyptian wheel?
It's not categorical, but evidence strongly suggests that that was where the Egyptian wheel was.
As a modern engineer, what do you think about these achievements of his?
I would think that it's very clever for its time, but so dangerous. I can't imagine how scary it must have been to be working at the coalface. It's fascinating to think that they were daring enough to go down there and extract that coal.
The most ingenious part of this mine is the Moat Pit, a shaft sunk into the seabed to enable access to the coal seam over 100 feet below. It's only accessible at low tide. I'm making the difficult journey out to the site with archaeologist Dr. Donald Adamson and coal mining historian Robert Yates.
Well, guys, we've had quite an adventure getting here. It's not actually easy to get to at all, is it? We're very, very lucky.
Yes, we are, because the tide is very low. So, I mean, normally you might have found it even harder to get here, strangely enough. It was hard enough as it was.
And now we're on it, I can start to make out the stone blocks here, and it looks like we've got one circle here, but there's evidence of something else going on out here as well.
There's an outer wall, and that was simply to contain rubble. Then there was a second wall, roughly where you're standing, and there was a void after that, which was filled with clay, puddled clay, hammered in with wooden boards to hold it in place. Then there was a shaft wall here, which I'm standing on, and then there was the shaft itself.
So coal was extracted from this shaft and then what, put onto boats that were mooring up here?
The primary purpose of this shaft, we believe, is ventilation. If you've got a shaft on land and a shaft on sea, they're interconnected, you will get an airflow because the rock beneath us is about 12 degrees centigrade. So in winter, air will be heated up a little bit by the strata, rise, suck in fresh air, and you'll get a circulation.
I just think it's amazing to come out here to see this and realise that this is not just a beautiful natural environment, this is a former industrial landscape.
It's simply extraordinary.
The mine is no longer accessible. But at the time, Bruce welcomed people from near and far to marvel at his great engineering achievement. Undoubtedly, the most famous visitor to the mine here was King James VI of Scotland, King James I of England. He was led from a shaft on the land out through a tunnel, and when he emerged out in the middle of the estuary there, he was surrounded by the sea. It was high water. He began to panic. He felt someone was trying to do him a mischief, to do him in. Treachery, treachery, treason, treason, he cried. And then his host calmed him down. Look, sir, all you have to do is go back through the tunnel the way you came, or we can get a boat for you. That calmed the king down, and he ended up being mightily impressed with what was going on here. The ingenuity of constructing an artificial island in the estuary with a ventilation shaft is what really put Culross on the map.
Bruce's coal industry in this village became so renowned that in the 17th century it gave its name to a standard unit measurement of coal, the cuirass chowder. 4,000 tonnes of coal per year was produced at the Moat Pit. George Bruce was amassing a fortune.
Bruce ploughed some of his wealth into the construction of his mansion, choosing to build it right in the heart of his many enterprises. And it sits right next to where the old harbour used to be. It's now known as Culross Palace.
It's a magnificent place, it really is. And superficially, it all looks like it could have been built at the same time. There's a great similarity here in the finishes, this harling, the rough render on the walls there, the same colour, and the dormer windows there, the little gablets above them, the pan tiles on all the roofs. There's a uniformity here. But in fact, this is a complex that's developed over a period of time. And I can see that because the ranges here, the main blocks of the building, are all slightly different scales. This one's slightly smaller. That one there is dated 1597, whereas the one in front, much larger, is dated 1611. So this is a place that's grown with the wealth of the person who owns it. It's called the Palace. It's not a palace, but it's palatial for the period.
Linda Whiteford, one of the guides here, can share some of its secrets with me.
Wow, look at this. Whole ceiling covered with paintings. It's just incredible.
It's wonderful, isn't it? This was a room that Sir George Bruce had designed, and it was really a way of showing off to his visitors, educating his family, because each one of these 16 panels has a bit in Latin and a bit in Old Scots, and they're all allegorical tales that would teach you something about life. And one of the panels in particular is really relevant today. This lady here is pointing to her mouth. And it basically says, watch what you say, because when it's out there, you can't take it back. Now, is that not 16th century Twitter?
Yes.
And there's much more to discover deeper in the palace.
This is pretty strange, isn't it? What, there's this funny sort of lobby type thing in the middle of this room. What's going on?
Well, this was the most heavily protected room in its day in the whole of the area. Never mind Culross, the whole of the area. This is George Bruce's strong room.
Ah, hence this iron door here.
Absolutely, and there would have been another one on the entranceway as well. Very narrow, so you couldn't get a sword out. It's got a sloping ceiling as well.
Yeah, I noticed that coming in, having to duck.
You'd have to stoop to get in. Yeah. So if anybody was trying to rob it, he'd be ready in here with an underthrust.
And the whole barrel-vaulted stone room, it feels like a fireproof vault.
Absolutely. Banks weren't invented until 1695, so a wealthy man had to have a special room in his home to protect everything that proved who he was, all his money, all the taxes in the town, because George was a tax collector, and this is it. It's 3 foot thick stone all the way round, and it was meant to be cannonball proof and fireproof. Now, there are other things that they did to protect. Would you like to come and see?
Yeah.
Okay. So here we are in the Laird's bedroom, just off the strong room. And
Oh, so he's sleeping right next to the fortune here. He's keeping an eye
Absolutely.
on it even when he's in his bed.
Absolutely. Look at all these marks along here. These are protection marks. These were put here to protect the fortune, to protect the people in this room from evil.
So you can look after your worldly wealth, you can keep that safe, but you have to look after your spiritual health.
At this time, you did everything to keep your family healthy and wealthy and keep evil away at all cost.
In the early 1600s, George Bruce's mine was at the height of its production and trade with Europe was thriving, which also influenced how his own home and the village looked.
You can pretty much go in.
Resident Paul Kelly MacLeod, who now chairs the Culross Community Council, is passionate about the village's unique characteristics.
The architecture here is very, very distinctive, isn't it?
That's right. Culross developed through the merchant trade with Belgium, so a lot of that Flemish influence is seen here in Culross. Also, the crow steps, those gabled steps are really practical. What they're there for is if somebody needs to fix the roof, there's a place for them to stand and they can put boards across and work on the roof.
And on these roofs, I mean, some of them originally may have been thatched or different roof materials, but many of them now have got pan tiles, those curved tiles.
The original pan tiles for this village have come across in George Bruce's shipping vessels.
Yeah.
And so the first place that would have had the pan tiles is the palace, and then it just caught on throughout the rest of the village.
Paul, whenever I see places as beautiful as this, I think about the work it takes to keep a place looking special.
That's right. In the 19th century, the town fell almost to ruin. And in the early 1900s, the National Trust of Scotland came along and decided this was a place worth saving. And so they started with the palace, and then they just continued to buy additional properties in the village and started preserving them over the last 60, 70, 80 years, and they continue to do that. And the way they mark that is by having those crests on top of the buildings that they've refurbished and preserved now.
And this is an ongoing thing. The people living here are extremely proud of it. They want it to live on into the future. You want it to live. You've
Absolutely.
immersed yourself in it,
Yeah.
haven't you? I mean, it's quite obvious talking to you, the love of the history of the place, the love of the environment and of the people here.
The future of Culross is in its community, and the community is very passionate about preserving this place and making it viable for the future.
There's one more building I really want to get a look at.
Well, this is a very prominent building in a very prominent location overlooking what would have been the harbour. And you can tell it's a public building. The big stairs leading up to it there, the big central front door. Now, it's largely a building of the 17th century, the early 17th century, except for that tower. That's about 150 years later. That's into Georgian times, late 18th century. But back in the 17th century, this was the administrative centre of the village. This was where the town council sat. It was the customs house. There were courtrooms in there and a prison.
The prison had a dark and shocking purpose. In 1597, King James VI of Scotland wrote a book titled Demonology. It poured fuel on an already emerging panic about witchcraft. Dr. Fiona Morrison has studied how this mass hysteria came to Culross.
Well, Fiona, interesting old building, and you brought me right up here, or in the rafters, right in the apex of the roof.
Yeah, you are right back in the part of the building that was built in 1626. You are actually standing in a room that was used for women that were accused of being witches. In Culross, 30 women and 2 men were accused. Some women with a disability, perhaps, mental or physical, or perhaps just didn't look right, a little bit deformed. Even women with black cats, I know that sounds ridiculous, they could be accused of being witches.
this is like neighbourhood grudges, or you didn't like the look of someone, or what, all that could play into it. You could shop someone and they would end up here.
And if you were accused, you really didn't have much chance. There is a story of a lady called Mary Cunningham and her daughter, Janet Erskine. And Mary was a wealthy widow. She lived in Culross. We're fortunate in that Mary kept a record of her time. She was kept in this room, she and her daughter. She was arrested at night, taken up here, in the dark. They were given water and that was it. So she and her daughter were pretty much starving. They were here for weeks. Mary and her daughter were stripped and they were tortured. And if you stopped shouting out in pain, they said, you were definitely a witch. Mary was lucky. She got herself a solicitor. The solicitor argued her case, and she and her daughter were very fortunate, and they got off. They were one of the few people to get off.
And it's a sort of mass hysteria that leads to this utter tragedy.
Although these things happened 400 years ago, they're stories, but we have to remember these were real women, and they did live here, and sadly most of them also died here, and we shouldn't really forget them.
The decline of the village's fortunes began in March 1625 with the arrival of a great storm.
The news of the death of King James, which occurred on the 27th of March, reached Edinburgh on the 30th at the outbreak of a storm of extraordinary violence which raged along the whole coast, destroying much shipping and throwing down several harbours. This was a once-in-a-generation storm. It was appalling. It destroyed most of the ports in the Forth Estuary. It flooded the Moat Pit. This was a calamity for George Bruce, and 5 weeks later, at the age of 75, he passed away, some say of a broken heart.
He was laid to rest in this magnificent tomb, which was testament to the great wealth he'd amassed. After George Bruce's death, his eldest son tried to keep trade going in the village. But the sea had destroyed the artificial island beyond repair, and its mine never reopened. Culross became a ghost town and slowly fell into a state of disrepair. But thanks to the efforts of the villagers and the National Trust of Scotland, the village is now being restored to its former glory.
If you're lucky enough to visit Culross today, the amount of care that's gone into repairing these buildings, to conserving the village, is plain to see. What's much less obvious is the important story of the industry here. How entrepreneurs such as George Bruce battled with and against nature to drive trade, commerce, and that is what ultimately has built this magnificent village by the sea.